This is a long-standing economic problem, is how do you balance the role of the state, as Bhaskar was saying, in controlling what would be otherwise a completely unregulated market where market forces win out against people. We still have that problem. There still is an enormous amount of confusion. You know, I have people holding signs saying, keep the government hands out of my Medicare, because they clearly didn't understand Medicare as a government program. And you have this lack of understanding that's deliberately created. It's deliberately made complicated and hard to follow, hard to understand, so that when somebody gets up and says the problem is overregulation, people say, yeah, that sounds right. You know, it makes sense at a visceral level more than at an intellectual level. And people respond to it viscerally, not analytically.
Welcome to Age of the Obsolete, a weekly podcast that examines the intersection of technology, democracy, and the future of work. I'm your host, John Ravito. Go into any bookstore in the United States, and regardless of literary trends or political fashion, one book that remains as popular today as when it was first published is Atlas Shrugged. In the 1990s, a survey by the Library of Congress named Atlas Shrugged as the most influential book in the Bible. Written by Russian émigré Ayn Rand in 1957, the 1,200-page novel is an ode to unfettered free market capitalism. The book's premise is that the true heroes of democracy are neither its scientists nor its military leaders and politicians, but rather the businessmen who create the companies and products and, most importantly, the jobs that result in our material wealth and well-being. Without these captains of industry, the economic engine would grind to a halt and the world would fall into anarchy. In Atlas Shrugged, the greatest challenge leaders face is to free themselves not from competition, but from the shackles imposed upon them by what Ayn Rand calls lesser men, who weigh them down with stifling government regulations. As the book's hero John Galt explains, the only proper functions of a government are the police, the army to protect you from foreign invaders, and the courts to protect your property. John Galt's views are echoed by Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman in explaining his ideal society.
The fundamental principle that I am going to try to uphold was stated by John Stuart Mill in On Liberty over 100 years ago. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. That's the fundamental principle.
For Ayn Rand and her followers, the only viable economic model is one that demands the removal of all state interference from both our personal lives and business affairs. True value is determined by the market, not by religion or philosophy. Concepts such as self-sacrifice, altruism, and economic justice are remnants of a benighted past. Yet as Professor Lynn Keisling of Northwestern University points out, a capitalism totally devoid of morality is a system totally alien to the writings and sentiments of Adam Smith, who, in addition to self-interest, argues for both sympathy and beneficence in economic life.
He views man as a social being, and his life's work was devoted to developing a coherent theory of the systematic understanding of man's nature as a social being and how operate in society. In the Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, he lays out the foundations of that systematic science of man, starting with moral philosophy and human nature. And he grounds his idea of moral philosophy in something that he characterizes as sympathy, which was a very hot topic among Smith, Hume, Adam Ferguson, Francis Hutcheson in the 1750s and 60s. Sympathy for Smith combined empathy, the emotional connection, emotional interconnectedness that we feel with other human beings, with the judgment and evaluation of individuals' behavior in particular situations. Smith definitely argues that individuals make decisions and make choices based primarily on self-interest, but his definition of self-interest is very broad. Smith's definition of self-interest includes this idea of sympathy and mutual sympathy and the fellow feeling that you feel with others who matter to you. But he also recognizes, and this is a time when Smith is writing with folks like Rousseau and Hobbes as counterpoints, that other scholars are arguing that selfish desires can harm and injure other people. So in the theory of moral sentiments, he has to confront this question of how do we contain the selfish desires of individuals that may injure others while still enabling individuals to thrive. One of the most important distinctions that Smith draws in the theory of moral sentiments is the distinction between justice. Beneficence is just, benevolent activities towards others without any sense of any, repayment or reciprocity or benefit to yourself.
For Ayn Rand, there is no place for either sympathy or beneficence in economics. To argue for their inclusion is to replace rational thought with sentimentality, as she tells CBS newsman Mike Wallace in this 1959 interview.
I am primarily the creator of a new code of morality which has so far been believed impossible, namely a moralist on faith.
On faith?
Not on faith. Not on arbitrary whim, not on emotion, not on arbitrary edict, mystical or social, but on reason, a morality which can be proved by means of logic, which can be demonstrated to be true and necessary, that each man must live as an end in himself and follow his own rational self-interest.
And you believe that there should be no right by the government to tax? You believe that there should be no such thing as welfare legislation, unemployment compensation, regulation during times of stress, certain kinds of rent controls and things like that?
That's right. I'm opposed to all forms of control. I am for an absolute, laissez-faire, free, unregulated economy.
It would be easy to dismiss Rand's book as poor writing compounded by bad philosophy. The problem is that much of what she writes continues to resonate with many of today's business leaders, not only because her philosophy appeals to their economic interests, but also to their vanity. John Galt is more than simply a character in a novel. He's a heraldic figure, a hero that transcends the rest of humanity. In this regard, he adheres to what is known as the great man theory, a popular 19th century idea promulgated by Thomas Carlyle, in which history can be largely explained by the impact of great men or heroes, individuals who, due to their creativity, charisma, or intelligence, have a decisive impact on society. John Galt disdains the servile bureaucrats with whom he must interact. For him, they are looters, perpetual takers, ineffectual civil servants that create nothing to the sum total of the world. But that was never true, not in the novel and even less in reality. Since the rise of the Industrial Revolution, free markets and unfettered capitalism have been more myth than reality. Because of its ability to create unbounded wealth, capitalism has always been subject to both individual and corporate abuse. Government oversight has therefore been necessary to curb those abuses, but not to the extent that it also curbs investment and innovation. The best system is therefore one that workers with the profit-driven needs of the companies that employ them, but not for Ayn Rand. When John Galt tells the world that the only proper function of government is to protect our rights, what he's talking about are his rights as well as those of the business class which he represents. But we work in the factories and buy his products. Are their rights of a lesser order simply because they are not entrepreneurs or job creators? Isn't the government also bound to protect them from greed and venality, from unfair labor practices and hazardous working conditions, from exploitation and manipulation by those of greater wealth and power? As a Russian émigré, Ayn Rand patently opposed the collectivism and centralized control imposed by the Soviet regime. Yet rather than invoke a capitalism that benefited all, her philosophical hatred of communism, a veiled social Darwinism of winners and losers and nothing in between. What she failed to comprehend is that the world is defined by more than fang and claw competition, and that community and cooperation are just as important in economics as they are in nature. Just as lions and wolves and other animals will work together towards a goal that none could achieve as individuals, success in business comes about not only because of the dominant personality of an alpha executive, but also because different groups of varying skills and intelligence work together towards a common goal. Entrepreneurs are key drivers of the economic engine. It's by their brilliance and determination that products are developed, jobs created, and prosperity established. But without the millions of people that labor in their offices, factories, labs, centers, their products and creations would be nothing more than stillborn ideas that never come to market. So when we look to the future, to the changing nature of work and how we attribute personal value and worth, rather than Ayn Rand, a better guide would be the 17th century English poet John Donne, who observed that we are inextricably connected by our common humanity.
No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind.
This is John Ravito saying thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions or need additional information on any of these podcasts, please go to our website at ageoftheobsolete.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.